Scott, good to see you. How you doing? You're the first one in. How you been, Scott? Mike, good to see you. How you doing? How you been? The screen looks a little weird. Is moding okay? Thank you. And you? I'm good, Scott. Good to see you. How you doing? Screen looks a bit weird. Is it? Maybe go out the live, come back in. Should be fixed, I think. I'm first today. Yeah, definitely you are. Okay, let's do intro and disclaimer. I'm so sorry about the noise. I'm at a business partner's house, and he does have a newborn baby. Sorry about the noise. Even the Miles of CMF, Joe, good to see you. How you doing? How you been? Okay, let's do intro, disclaimer. I can see you. It looks wide. Scott, go out of the live, come back in. It should be fixed. Okay, let me do intro, disclaimer. What we're going to go through on tonight's live because quite a bit to talk about. Welcome to the CMF Live. If you're watching this for the first time ever, the CMF Live stands for Crypto Miles Family. My name is Miles. You can tune to this live Monday, Friday, 10 p.m. London time onwards for the most recent news regarding cryptocurrencies, CBDCs, AI, and politics and regulations. Pretty much vital information for you to know about regarding the world completely transforming into a digital space. The disclaimer of this live show, as always, is not financial advice, not political advice, and whatever I say is only for entertainment purposes. Now, this is episode 426 of the CMF Live Show. Thank you so much to everybody who has already, I can see reposts are happening. Callie, thank you so much for the repost. Thanks so much to everyone who has already liked and reposted this live. If you're watching this on X, thanks so much to everyone who's also essentially liked the live as well if you're watching this on YouTube. And thank you, essentially a special thank you to everyone who's also put a comment outside the live as well. Now, on tonight's live, we're going to be talking about the senators, essentially what's been happening inside the crypto space. We're going to talk about America regarding the recent sell-off they had in terms of their bitcoins from the DOJ. We're going to go through some other news regarding prospective news of essentially what's coming out from different CEOs, from different companies, of how they think the crypto market is going to be playing out going forward, especially regarding the real-world assets market space. Now, I know that's a sore subject for the Chinese market space, but not so much in the Western market space. We're going to go through the S&P 500 news as well, because the S&P 500 might not be doing too well going forward, which could actually be a positive for the crypto space in general. So, first news on tonight's live we're going to cover is regarding Senator Luminous, who is not happy regarding DOJ selling off bitcoins. Before we talk about that, let's go inside the comment section first. This is happening there, and then straight into the first news. So let's see where we're at inside the comment section. We were here. I thought that cry was from the Venezuelan president. Good evening, Miles and CMF. Solomon, good to see you as well. How you doing? Good evening, Miles. How you doing, brother? I'm doing great. Callie, good to see you as well. Hello, brother Miles. T, good to see you as well. How you doing? Hello, Miles and CMF. Scott, let's go. XRP was up a little today. It definitely was. Everything was up a little bit today, and it came a little bit back down again. Now, first news on tonight's live is Senator Luminous. So yesterday there was news regarding a possible, essentially, DOJ selling off some sort of bitcoins. It wasn't confirmed until now, and this is the news. Senator Luminous essentially criticizes the U.S. Bitcoin sale in the reserve plan. In other words, the U.S. is supposed to have this reserve plan, but for some reason the DOJ decided to sell off a certain amount of Bitcoin. Senator Cynthia Luminous criticized essentially the U.S. Department of Justice for selling roughly 57.55 Bitcoin seized essentially from the Samurai wallet developers, despite an order to retain such assets essentially for the United States. The sale essentially challenges Executive Order 14233, sparking concerns over essentially U.S.-rigged asset management as other nations increase their Bitcoin reserves, potentially impacting the future of market strategies. Now, that's one of the reasons why the market came slightly lower today, essentially. The sale challenges on this matter. Senator Cynthia Luminous essentially has questioned the recent sale of that 57.55 Bitcoins by the U.S. Department of Justice, conflicting essentially President Donald Trump's executive order on January 6, 2026. The sale raises concerns about adherence to the strict essentially Bitcoin reserves, stirring debates about U.S. digital asset policies. And Senator Luminous also expressed concerns over the DOJ's decision to essentially selling that Bitcoin instead of retaining it for the Bitcoin essentially reserve the United States has. This action essentially follows a plea agreement by the Samurai Wallet developers. Luminous also contends that other nations are increasing their Bitcoin holdings, while the US appears to be moving in the opposite direction. The sale has sparked criticism from Bitcoin prominents who believe that essentially not retaining these assets might essentially disadvantage the US financially, and Senator Cynthia Luminous also emphasized the strategic importance of retaining Bitcoin, giving its increasing global financial essentially significance. Beyond the immediate Bitcoin community, Luminous also comments have highlighted potential essentially policy mismanagement, suggesting a need for much more clearer guidelines on handling digital assets. Why essentially is the US government still selling Bitcoin while Trump has clearly indicated that these assets should be retained to establish a strict Bitcoin reserve for the United States, while other countries are essentially continuously increasing their Bitcoin holdings? We are squandering these strict assets, which essentially we cannot afford. I'm deeply concerned about this report, said Senator Cynthia Luminous. Historically, the US government sold essentially forfeited assets to fund various initiatives, yet the establishment of the Bitcoin-specific reserve marked a change in approach, which meant essentially the United States, any assets they do seize in terms of crypto assets should be used in terms of the essentially crypto reserve assets for the United States, not to be sold off. So if you're wondering to yourself why the crypto markets came slightly down today, main reason was that the US aiming for becoming the capital of cryptocurrencies, selling essentially a Bitcoin essentially reserve doesn't really comply with what they said previously. If I had to take a guess, I would say the Democrats were involved in some sort of a way on selling that Bitcoin through the DOJ, because I don't think, regarding the Republicans who do support Trump, they would be essentially doing anything on that line. I could be wrong, and it could be Republicans that did push for the DOJ to sell the Bitcoin as well. Now, moving on from that to the CPI data that's going to be released very, very soon, which is also going to be having an impact on the crypto market space as well. Here it is. US CPI released to essentially influence crypto markets. The US will release its consumer price index data, essentially was on January 13th. Keep down your calendars. January 13th, the CPI data is coming out. It's already drawing attention from key cryptocurrency figures and financial markets due to its potential impact on Bitcoin and other crypto assets. This event essentially matters because previous CPI releases have significantly influenced crypto markets' volatility. Can everyone give me 1 second? I'll be back. Just 1 second. Sorry about that, everyone. Sorry about that. Now, going back to what I was saying, essentially, regarding the CPI data. So the CPI data is going to be released on January, essentially, 13th, and it may influence, essentially, the cryptocurrency market space, as it usually does. Key industry figures like Arthur Hayes, essentially, and CZ are closely watching right now, essentially, the market space to see how the CPI data is going to be reacted inside the crypto market space. Also, immediate effects might occur inside the crypto markets, essentially market industries, impacting liquidity and pricing volatility, is essentially what they're suggesting. The financial implications of the CPI data will be significant for crypto, affecting essentially risk-taking behaviors among investors. Institutional flows also could change essentially based on the economic outlooks. Prediction indicates essentially that the macro trends essentially in inflation will pivot essentially it will play into a pivotal role. Investors are essentially advised to monitor economic indicators as key variables for market strategies may change. Now, the macro essentially is back in control. CPI print essentially print next week will set the tone for Bitcoin. So in other words, if you want to see what, regarding the crypto market space, is it going to go on the upside or is it going to go on the downside a little bit? The CPI data would play a factor into it. Good news, market good. Bad news, it could act at this moment in time, because we don't have regulations. Good news can be seen as bad news, and bad news can be seen as good news. We've seen this in the past when we had good news inside the crypto market space, but the market didn't react because due to not having essential regulations, manipulation is very easy to create. Now, putting that to one side, if CPI essentially stays above 2.6%, expect essentially Fed patience and more reluctant essentially to cut interest rates. If CPI essentially drops below 2.5%, watch for essentially a long squeeze in risk assets. Arthur Hayes, essentially, that was his perspective. And I do essentially agree with what Arthur Hayes has said. But I also, playing on the other card, which is in the past, we have had extremely good news for the crypto space, but no market reaction or market went on the downside. Essentially, that's due to not having regulations and being instead of very volatile and manipulated market space where good news could be seen as bad news and bad news could be seen as good news. Now, moving on from that to the S&P 500, but keep that in your calendars, January 13th, CPI data. The next thing we are going to be talking about tonight's live is a perspective coming out from Bank of America. But before we talk about that, let's go to the comment section. This particular news I'm going to read out to you next is a positive play in the crypto market space, depending on how it goes. Now, let's see what's happening inside the comment section and we go straight into the next news. So let's see where we were at. We were at here. As I said previously, this is live, which means if you have any questions, go for inside the comment section. More than happy to help you out. Share the live, folks. Let's go. Scott, ban on tariffs, bullish or bearish for crypto? Ban on tariffs is good for crypto, and it did happen today, but yet the market didn't react the way it's supposed to. The need to move money quietly creates a need for XRP, XDC, and XLM. I do agree with that 100%. Share the live. Let's go, Scott. Hey, brother Miles and CMF, Comatose, good to see you. How you doing? Hit the like. Let's go. Is there a minimum number of XRP you will need to hold no matter what happens? I'm not looking for a number, just a yes or no response. Is there a minimum amount of XRP you should be holding? No. Any amount would be sufficient enough. Now, but it also does depend on what you're planning on to do with it next. XRP, XLM, XDC, H1 hot. Let's go, Scott. Let's promote our group by harnessing the link, the best group online. Let's go, Scott. Let's go, CMF. Good evening, Miles and the CMF. Manny, good to see you as well. How you doing? Good evening. Hi, Miles. Is this the start for the bull run? Johnny, I would say give it a little bit of time. Hello, my friend. Let's go, Scott. When can we see significantly? When can we see significantly movements? When can we see significant movements? We need major good news or major essentially regulations in play. Now, news only plays a certain amount of play inside the crypto space. In other words, good news boosts the market for about 1 to 2 days, or you can even stretch to 3 to 4 days, essentially. But regulations essentially is what pushes the market and builds the foundation for it. So regulation news essentially is excellent. It boosts the market space for a longer period. However, news essentially boosts the market for max 3 to 4 days. So we need some regulations coming out ASAP. Or essentially some licensings to be happening on Ripple side even. Let's see where we're at. Supreme Court will rule on the tariffs on Friday, which is true, yes. The Supreme Court is going to be ruling on tariffs. In other words, the tariffs that Trump essentially did on the United States, in terms of, tariffing other countries, bringing all that essentially cash inflow back into the US. There is a Supreme Court essentially that is going against Donald Trump. No surprise there. A lot of people are going against Donald Trump essentially in terms of politics. But is that going to have any sort of impact on the market space? Probably yes. But is it going to have any sort of impact in the long run? Probably no. Whatever Democrats tend to do when they go against Trump, it has some sort of effect on the crypto market space for about max 72 hours, and then essentially it wears off, or 40, or even 48 hours to be fairly honest. Movements, let's go. Joe, let's go. Miles, what's your top 10 list on coins? Johnny's actually posted on the Telegram group for the CMF. If you want to go check it out. Good evening, Professor Miles. Good to see you as well, Funky. How you doing? How you been? Good evening, Miles at CMF. Free Fabric. Good to see you as well. How you doing? Just got back from Goa, India. Let's go, Funky. I read there is a high percentage they rule against the tariffs. Any thoughts regarding, honestly, going against the US tariffs? going against Donald Trump regarding the tariffs. It's a losing battle, a waste of taxpayers' money that the Supreme Court essentially is using to go after Donald Trump. Any politician that tries to go after Donald Trump is just a losing battle and a waste of absolute everybody's time. And it does affect the market space as well for a very short period of time. I read that there's Happy New Year, CMF. Let's go for Happy New Year to you as well. When can we see a Clarity Act? Well, we're hoping for a Clarity Act before the midterms, essentially. Because if we go into the midterms, we might have another incident where essentially the Democrats don't want to play ball, as usual, when it comes to anything to do with the crypto space. So we're hoping that we get the Clarity Act out of the way before the midterms, rather than after the midterms, or before we have another government shutdown, essentially. Honestly, if you want, if you're looking for somebody to blame on why the crypto market space hasn't picked up yet, it's the Democrats. And I'm being completely honest. If you want somebody to blame inside the crypto space of why the American market space hasn't rallied up and picked up the way it's supposed to do, it's the Democrats. And there are other factors in play. The banks are also, some banks like JP Morgan, at the beginning didn't like the idea of tech companies becoming banks. You could tell that when the banking associations essentially all rallied up together to go to the OCC and trying to slow down on giving essentially any sort of licensings to companies like essentially Ripple, Paxos, and Circle. So some banks do have some certain play into it as well, but they do weaponize essentially the Democratic essentially politicians to go after the crypto space. So honestly, if you want anybody to blame on why things essentially haven't moved at a much more rapid pace, it's the Democratic Party. All they care about is filling their own pockets and damaging essentially the crypto market space, which damages, essentially retail members inside the crypto market space. I brought up with yesterday's live. Yep, calls. Let's go, funky brother. Miles, do you see XRP going down again? It's always a possibility. We're on the whole market space. Miles, you rate Beam used to, I would have to say. It's good inside the gaming sector, I would have to say. And ADA. Didn't used to, but now I do. What is the midterms? The midterms essentially is what essentially, regarding how Trump continuing forward, yes or no, in that kind of sense. Simplest way to put it. Morning, Miles of CMF. Shelly, good to see you as well. How you doing? Morning. Miles, please get the Clarity Act passed. Please get the Clarity Act passed. If not, we are in trouble with crypto. Many Democrats and some of the Republicans are at fault. Yes, there are a few Republicans, I do agree, that are at fault, but it's the majority of the Democratic Party. They hate the idea that Trump's family is making so much money from crypto, but also they get it weaponized by the banking sector to slow down tech companies from becoming banks and eventually taking over banks. They will vote on January 15th for the Clarity Act, I believe. Yes, that is correct. Can Beam go high in price or no? Consider variable change. Now, Bank of America has given their perspective essentially on the market space on the S&P 500. Now, why is that relevant essentially to the crypto market space? Well, if the S&P 500 essentially is not doing too well going forward, then maybe investors essentially will go to alternative market spaces, which is the crypto market space, which has happened in the past. So here it is. Bank of America essentially warns that the S&P 500 rally is losing momentum. Bank of America essentially analysts are cautioning that the recent rally in the S&P 500 essentially may be nearing its limits, citing elevated valuations, weak participation across stocks, and a heavy concentration in a small group of mega-cap technology names. The warning essentially was led by Savatier, the firm's essentially chief equity strategist at Bank of America, who argues that the current market conditions leave little no room for disappointment. According to the Bank of America, the S&P 500 now appears overvalued, essentially on an 18 out of 20 valuation metrics essentially tracked by the firm. These include commonly referenced essentially measures such as the price-to-book ratios and the market capitalization relative to GDP. Notably, 9 of those metrics have surpassed levels reached essentially during the peak of the dot-com essentially bubble back in essentially March 2000, understanding essentially how essentially stretched valuations have become by historical standards. The analysts also essentially from the chief essentially from Bank of America described the market as being priced for perfection, meaning that earnings growth essentially must remain strong and corporate margins must stay essentially elevated to justify current prices. Any negative surprises in economic data or corporate essentially earnings could trigger a correction. Another essentially major concern is weak market essentially. The majority of the index gains have been driven by a small group of AI-focused mega-cap technology stocks, often essentially referenced to the Magnificent Seven. When a fewer stocks essentially participate in a rally, it can signal essentially fragility beneath the surface. And Bank of America views this concentration risk as a warning sign that momentum may not be sustainable. The firm also highlighted liquidity risk, noting that the passive investment funds now hold a large share of the S&P 500 essentially float in a stress essentially scenario, such as essentially raising interest rates or turmoil in private markets. This structure could also lead to forced selling and amplifying volatility. Adding to the pressure, the massive capital expenditures required essentially for AI infrastructure are beginning to weigh in on big tech companies in terms of free cash flow. This has already started to reduce stock buybacks, which have essentially been a majority source essentially of equity markets and support over the past decade. Reflecting these essentially risks, Bank of America has set a year-end 2026 target of 7,100 for the essentially S&P 500, one of the most conservative forecasts among essentially major Wall Street banks. The firm also recommends investors considering essentially rotating away from essentially crowded AI trades and towards less essentially favored sectors, including healthcare and real estate, where valuations and expectations are more restrained. Overall, the Bank of America's outlook suggests that while the bull market may persist, in other words, Bank of America is not suggesting we're going to a bear market in any sort of a way. They are suggesting we are still inside of a bull market. Its margin for error has narrowed significantly. So, Bank of America's chief essentially is giving out their perspective that the S&P 500 going forward is technically overvalued. It's on shaky grounds. And if that does happen, money should start flowing somewhere else. Now, they're essentially saying, go towards real estate or essentially healthcare. That's a safe play. But in some cases, some investors want to go for a much more risky play and go for an alternative market space, which tends to be the crypto market space. So that's been on shaky grounds regarding the S&P 500 could actually play out well for the crypto market space because it has in the past. Now, Bernstein is what we're going to talk about next on tonight's live. So Bernstein essentially predicts crypto growth aimed 2026 market shift. So Quantum, essentially a Bernstein analyst, reports medium to long-term upside potential for crypto in 2026. So moving away from Bank of America's perspective on, S&P 500 is going essentially forward very on shaky grounds. Bernstein's perspective is more on the crypto side, saying 2026 is actually going to be a brilliant year for the crypto space, recommending a focus on crypto stocks during market pullbacks. So in terms of S&P 500 being on shaky grounds, Bernstein is saying if you do want to go for the stock market, go for crypto stocks. Driven by tokenization and fintech growth, essentially Bernstein predicts significant opportunities, including a projected TVL essentially increase to $80 billion and Bitcoin's target price of $150,000. The analyst essentially indicates that the rapid expansion of tokenization and a positive outlook for Bitcoin is setting the stage for potential economic implications. Bernstein's analyst also anticipates an upsurge essentially in the crypto industry in 2026, proposing that tokenization will dominate in what he calls the super cycle for 2026. Bitcoin essentially is projected to hit $150,000 by 2026 for potential such 2027 peak of $200,000. Stablecoin supplies could see a 56% rise, potentially reaching $420 billion, supported by payment platforms such as Block and PayPal. Real-world assets tokenization total value locked TVL might also double, growing significantly essentially from the current $37 billion. And analysts foresee tokenization impacting traditional financial systems and driving innovation through essentially regulatory advancements. And adoption could also accelerate, particularly in fintechs and equity markets, reinforcing essentially cryptocurrency's role in the future economics. So on one side of the spectrum, essentially, we have Bank of America giving their perspective that the S&P 500 and the stock market essentially is on shaky grounds. On the other side of the perspective, we have essentially Bernstein's analyst suggesting that if you are, if you think that the S&P 500 is going to be on shaky grounds, then if you are still inside the stock market, maybe go for crypto stocks. Two different perspectives, but two on the same line, I would have to say. Now, Morgan Stanley is what we're going to talk about next on tonight's live. But before we talk about Morgan Stanley, let's go to the comment section first. Let's see what's happening there, and then we go straight into the next news. So let's see where we're at. we were at here. There is a Republican lady that is hold many of the cards too, because she's connected to Bitcoin. I shared that information about a week ago or so. Thank you for that, Scott. So the power doesn't only lie in the hands of Democrats, but this powerful Republican lady, it was articles I read today too. Okay, we have a DEX and are looking for sponsors. Any ideas on where we can reach out? You can send me an email, essentially, or send me a direct message on X if you want to check it out. No problem. I sold Beam essentially a while back, purchased XRP with the proceeds. Smart move, I would have to say, not financial advice at all. I sold everything. I took a loan and bought XRP in 2022 for 50 cents. Let's go, Bessie. Share the live. Let's go, Scott. Evening, Miles and family. Susie, good to see you. How you doing? Let's go, CMF. Share the live. Let's go, Scott. Good evening, Miles and CMF. Lena, good to see you. How you doing? Hi, Miles. Good to see you. Carl, good to see you. How you doing? Share the live. Let's go, Scott. Now, Morgan Stanley. Morgan Stanley essentially has filed in for a Bitcoin and Solana ETF. Morgan Stanley essentially filed for a spot Bitcoin and Solana ETF for essentially with the SEC, marking a pioneering essentially step by a top 10 US essentially bank into crypto. This move underscores a significant institutional interest in crypto markets, potentially impacting Bitcoin and Solana's valuations in the long run, not overnight, while signaling broader industry acceptance inside the financial sector. Morgan Stanley filed a Form S1 essentially with the SEC to launch a spot Bitcoin and Solana ETFs. This move essentially marks the first by the top US bank, highlighting the bank's interest in digital assets. Morgan Stanley aims to tap into Bitcoin's $120 billion ETF market space. The move involves Morgan Stanley Investment Management sponsoring a trust that will hold essentially Bitcoin directly. No executive comments were essentially reported alongside the filings. Morgan Stanley's filing could potentially influence the market for Bitcoin and Solana. The proposal essentially reflects a significant institutional commitment to crypto, aligning essentially with regulatory clarifications that have emerged recently. Now, the entry of Morgan Stanley into the ETF market essentially highlights a growing acceptance of Bitcoin Solana in traditional finance as well, which is perspective CoinDesk has given. The move essentially resembles spot Bitcoin ETF approvals back in 2024 by asset managers like BlackRock. These early introductions supported Bitcoin's growth essentially in highly volatile environments, suggesting possible trends for Morgan Stanley's products. Now, we did talk about essentially we could be expecting a lot more essentially ETFs in 2026, and it wasn't just one or two perspectives. Multitude of CEOs came out, including even Brad himself, or Brian Armstrong, essentially from Coinbase, and many of the CEOs from major financial institutions did come out and say that you should be expecting a lot more ETFs to be happening this year, especially a year of institutions and regulations. So no surprise there regarding Morgan Stanley coming forward for Bitcoin essentially and Solana ETF, but good, in other words, that they're taking action now in Q1. Now, moving on essentially from Morgan Stanley to a company that's about to pull off an incredible move. Ironically, a company that has some sort of ties with Ripple also. Here it is. And it's also relatable to Venezuela. So, Tecurium essentially seeks SEC approval for the first fund tracking Venezuelan stocks and companies. A financial firm has asked regulators to approve what would be the first investment fund focused on companies doing business in Venezuela. Already they're taking action. Arriving on the heels of major political changes in South American nation, the exchange-traded fund industry essentially manages $13.6 trillion in assets across almost 5,000 different products. Now it may essentially add another option targeting Venezuelan stocks. Tecurium essentially filed paperwork essentially with the Securities and Exchange Commission to create a Venezuelan exposure ETF. The proposed fund would allow essentially an index tracking Venezuelan-based businesses and companies that either keep more than half of their assets in Venezuela or make over 50% of their money from operations there. This means that the fund would essentially just buy stocks listed in Venezuela, but would also essentially include any company heavily involved in the country. The filing came just days after the United States conducted a secret weekend essentially operation to remove Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro from power. If approved, this would break new grounds. While several funds currently hold Venezuelan government debt, information from Bloomberg Intelligence shows that no existing ETF attempts to give investors access to Venezuelan stocks, which remains a small with limited trading activity. The Caracas Essentially Stock Exchange jumped 16.45% based on this news. Eric, who is essentially a Bloomberg ETF specialist analyst, who analyzes essentially ETFs for Bloomberg Intelligence, said the timing makes sense. Despite many unanswered questions about Venezuela's future, government, and the real-world difficulties of investing there, this is what Eric had to say. It's something that essentially isn't totally ETF able. It's a frontier country with no liquidity, essentially, Eric said. This is the ETF industry being optimistic, essentially, and trying to essentially take advantage of the moment. Maduro's removal sparked a sharp rise in Venezuelan bond markets. Long-term creditors are now essentially wondering if this could finally lead to negotiations over the country's debt burden. Venezuela essentially quit making debt payments around 8 years ago, and reconstructing essentially discussions have essentially been virtually absent due to American sanctions. The political shift has helped the limited number of ETF essential holdings in Venezuelan debt. One example essentially is the virtuous Stone Harbor emerging markets essentially high yield bond ETF, known by essentially its ticker VEMI, which started increasing its Venezuelan bond holdings roughly a year ago, according to a portfolio manager, Jim Cringe. Now, Jim, essentially, who serves as a chief investment officer at Stone Harbor Investment Partners, thinks a debt reconstructing deal could happen within the next 18 to 24 months. The defaulted debt we owe essentially in the fund and across our strategies has increased significantly in price, and it should continue to do so, said essentially Jim on Bloomberg Television ETF IQ program. It's trading essentially at 35 cents on the dollar, and the claim value essentially is between 1.5 and 2 times that. So you do a pretty simple reconstructing. We expect a lot of value out of this. Even with positive feelings about Venezuela's debt, Eric essentially thinks the potential customer base essentially for a Venezuelan stock is probably essentially limited. However, it represents one of the rare unexplored areas for companies competing essentially in the packed ETF marketplace. Toad Swan noted essentially that such opportunities emerge when circumstances create possibilities for new investment options. Every now and then, an event or catalyst occurs, and the industry realizes no matter how small the gap or the niche, the matter essentially is that there is potential for new exposure. I agree with it 100%. Regarding the Venezuelan people being completely freed from their dictator, now companies are already taking action essentially in Venezuela, trying to create ETFs in Venezuela and trying to bring it back inside the world, the rest of the world, essentially, simplest way to put it. Also, the company that's doing this whole ETF for Venezuelan stocks is a company that has ties with Ripple. So that is an interesting play. Also, what I said yesterday regarding XRP, a speculative news that I read out on yesterday's live, that XRP might have some sort of plays, but hasn't been any sort of confirmations whatsoever, so we're going to consider it speculative. But going to today, regarding a company that does have ties with Ripple, deciding to get involved and create the first ever Venezuelan ETF. That's an interesting play, I would have to say. Now, moving on essentially from Venezuela to Florida essentially. Sorry about that, to Florida. But before we talk about Florida, let's go inside the comment section first. Let's see what's happening there. And then we go straight into the next news. As I said previously, this is live, and I read everybody's comments one by one as well. So if you do have a question, go for it. Let's see where we're at. Let's go, CMF. Let's go. Lena, good evening, Miles and CMF. Good to see you, Lena. How you doing? Susie, good to see you as well. How you doing? Hi, Miles. Good to see you. Carl, good to see you as well. How you doing? Miles, will oil sold from Venezuelan reserves be done by using crypto? It's been mentioned, yes, but it's not confirmed in any sort of a way. Previously, Venezuelan government used to sell the oil through Bitcoin and USDT due to the amount of sanctions that were put onto Venezuela. Now, obviously, that route has stopped. So it could essentially be used other alternative assets. It could be fiat, or essentially it could just be a crypto project that is essentially recognized by the United States, which technically is only XRP. Miles, essentially, I sent you a private message. Could you read it and give me your opinion? No problem, Carl. I'll check it after the live. Would crypto be the way that sanctioned essentially countries get around sanctions? Yes. Crypto is the only way sanctioned countries get around sanctions, essentially. I talked about this yesterday as well, regarding essentially countries like Russia, essentially in Iran and North Korea and Venezuela, using essentially Bitcoin and USDT and a few of the crypto projects for money laundering purposes. Essentially, they have been using it for the longest time. Ironically, today there was news released that Iran has essentially, the reason why we saw a boost inside the crypto market space yesterday, if you're wondering to yourself why we had a boost inside the crypto market space yesterday, there was news that was released today that said the Iranian government has essentially, and not just the Iranian government, but a lot of people from Iran also have been moving their funds towards cryptocurrencies due to the protests that are happening in Iran and the currency of Iran completely collapsing, you could pretty much say. A lot of people yesterday rushed towards crypto in Iran. Government and non-government people rushed towards crypto. Hence why essentially we saw quite a bit of a jump in crypto yesterday. And I talked about that yesterday regarding Iran is, essentially using crypto to launder money. Russia is one. It says sanctioned countries are doing this right now. And today we have that news coming out where Iran essentially, boosted the crypto market space because they were shifting so much of their own assets or money on the crypto market space because the Iranian currency is pretty much on the verge of collapse. So regarding sanctioned countries using essentially crypto for sanctioned behavior, yes. Hi, Miles of CMF. Good to see you as well, Keith. How you doing? Hit the like. Let's go Messi. Let's go Ripple. Let's go CMF. Let's go Scott. The Venezuelan people have been liberated. I agree with that 1,000,000%. The frequency forge, I agree with that 100%. Good to see how you doing. Good to see you as well. I think BlackRock and many of these other firms have knowledge unknown to the retailers and about to essentially make a mint. I agree with that 100% as well. Miles, will the market still drop down again? It's a possibility because we don't have regulations. The market right now is moving on speculation. And when the crypto market space moves on speculation, we have ups and downs, to be fairly honest. We need regulations in place. The faster we get regulations, the better we off. I've been saying this for the past year as well, the past 2 years, you can even say. We need a strong foundation. Price action from speculative behavior is no good. A strong foundation based on regulations is what we need. Miles with the market. So XRP has set essentially a foundation to explode. I am being essentially as patient as possible, but boy, if I can wait, it is going to essentially be worth it. Let's go, Scott. Hi, Miles at CMF. Stormy, good to see you. How you doing? How you been? Now, Florida has just introduced something interesting. Here it is. Florida essentially proposes a groundbreaking cryptocurrency reserve law. The proposed bill, introduced by Florida House of Representatives John essentially Snyder, aims to establish a statewide cryptocurrency reserve. As a member essentially of the Republican Party, Snyder essentially actions align with the party's stance of being crypto-friendly since Trump's assumption of the office. The representative essentially has formally initiated the process to create this reserve, essentially to bolster financial resilience and adapt essentially to the digital economy in Florida. The essentially fund, which will be managed by the state's chief financial officer, CFO, is designed to serve as a shield against inflation. In the past 2 years, it has permitted investments and assets valued at over essentially $500 billion. Presently, essentially, Bitcoin meets this criteria. Ethereum essentially could also be influenced if surpasses $388 billion mark, remaining above $500 billion for the 2 years. The summary of the legislative proposal includes several key elements. Florida essentially aims to establish a state cryptocurrency reserve as a fund separate from the state treasury. The proposal outlines the provisioning essentially of reserve resources and ensures its management essentially and essentially administration. The CFO essentially is authorized to cover specific expenses through the net income derived from crypto in the reserves or sales. Moreover, it provides also the CFO with the authority to invest in the funds from the reserves and consider essentially transforming specific reserves and monies to the state treasury under certain circumstances. The legislation also identifies the requirements for purchasing cryptocurrencies for the reserve and allows contracting essentially from third parties for reserve administrations and managements. It further essentially empowers the CFO to use directive essentially products under distinct essentially conditions and permits hiring essentially certified accountants for independent audits. Also, additionally, the legislative proposal authorizes temporary monetary transfers from the reserve for particular essential purposes. To support the initiative, the Florida State essentially cryptocurrency reserve advisory committee would be established within the Department of Financial Services. So Florida mentioned this a long time ago, essentially creating some sort of a crypto reserve similar to essentially what Donald Trump has done. Now there actually seems like moving forward with it. They're still sticking by $500 billion above by the looks of it in terms of market cap before essentially it's considered into the Florida essential reserves, which I think is stupid in some sort of a way, because there are so many great assets out there that they could get into at a much more lower essentially value and grow it exceptionally essentially for essentially the state of Florida, for example. But that's what happens when you have politicians making decisions and not intelligent people. Simplest way to put it. Now, but it is a positive in a sense. Europe is what we're going to talk about next. So, before we talk about Europe, let's consider the conversation first. Let's see where we're at. We were at here. Yo, from Orlando, Florida. How you doing, Talk? How you been? JP, good evening, Miles, and all the CMF. Good to see you, JP. How you doing? Hi, Miles. Paul, good to see you as well. How you doing? Now, Europe. Will we still expect to see three figures XRP 2026? I would say it still goes back to what I said. We need the green light of regulations, which is a clarity. We need green light for regulations. We don't get the regulation we need, which is a Clarity Act, which means institutions will have difficulty coming forward. We don't get that, it's going to be slightly difficult, is what I would say. So we need regulations as soon as possible. We get the green light of regulations, the sky's the limit is the easiest way to put it. Now, the European essentially central bank official warns White House attacks on the Fed's independence and threatens dollar's global dominance. So, as you may know, for the longest time, Trump is not the biggest fan of Jerome Powell, which, to be fair, nobody is. Anybody with an IQ essentially above 10 knows essentially that Jerome Powell is doing horrendous at his job, the easiest way to put it, where he's not doing rate cuts at the time he should be doing any sort of rate cuts, and he's sluggerish, similar to essentially what Gary Gensler was, wasting everybody's entire time. The European Bank is coming out and saying that basically the Fed should stay independent and politics should not be anywhere near it. I would have to call BS on that, because we know for a fact where Jerome Powell stands essentially is with the Democratic Party, not with the Republican Party, or essentially, what the European Party is suggesting, that they're completely independent and that Trump is going to essentially weigh in and not make it independent anymore. That's complete BS. The Fed has never been independent. On paper, yes, the Fed is extremely independent on paper. In reality, however, it isn't. It never has been independent on essentially in reality. On paper, it has. Now, this is what the European markets had to say regarding Trump, Jerome Powell, and the Fed. A top European banking official essentially today said that Washington's recent moves against the Federal Reserve are putting the US dollars essentially putting the US dollar's global standing at risk. Francis Villio, essentially, who sits on the European Central Bank's main discussion-making body, laid out his concerns during a speech in Paris today. He pointed out to three areas where American policy choices are creating problems for the currency that has long served as the world's primary reserve asset. The French central banker essentially said the White House attacks are essentially on the Fed's independence, questions about America's budget management, and new trade barriers that isolate the country from world markets are all eating away at the foundations that made the dollar dominant. Some recent US policies have undermined some pillars of the US dollar's dominance by attacking the Fed's independence, raising doubts as the US's physical discipline, and imposing essentially tariffs that diminish US integration with the global economy. He also essentially told audience gathered essentially for an event celebrating France's leadership of the Group of Seven Nations. He added that worries about Washington potentially using dollar-based payment systems as political weapons are pushing other countries to essentially build their own alternatives. These developments are shaking investors' trust in dollar-backed investments and will likely speed up and slow but steady movements towards using multiple currencies in international trade, he said. I'm going to call complete BS on his entire essentially speech. One, this moron from essentially European Bank mentioned that the dollar is essentially, the dollar not being valued as what it was before, not being seen as what it was before, is because of Trump essentially, trying to essentially control the Fed, which is complete BS. The dollar was failing before Trump ever entered into politics, to put it simply, is the best. And essentially suggesting that other countries are moving away from the US dollars because of Donald Trump's meddling and creating their own alternative payment systems, again, is complete BS. BRICS was designed when Biden was in power, not when Donald Trump was president of the United States. So this entire speech of Donald Trump is the reason that dollar essentially is losing the dominant face it used to have. Is complete BS. Biden was essentially the president of the United States when BRICS was invented on paper, to be fairly honest. But again, you can tell where these bankers stand in the European market space. Bankers, Europeans, in terms of politics, they tend to stand on the much more liberal side, which is the Democratic side, rather than the essentially Republican side, which is the right-wing side, essentially. Officials at the European Central Bank have been saying for some time that the uncertainty surrounding the dollar largely stemming from President Donald Trump's public criticism of Fed Chairman Jerome Powell, complete BS, creates an essentially opening for the euro to take on bigger roles in global finance. They're trying to use what's happening essentially in terms of Trump trying to, make the Fed do what it's supposed to do, its job, as a gameplay to make the European currency stronger. They're trying to say Donald Trump is a bad businessman. He's controlling the Fed. He's going to damage the US dollars, and therefore everybody should go towards the European currency. What's essentially beneficial about the European currency? Nothing. France is crippling as an economy. Germany is crippling as an economy. Italy is pretty much standing on its own last leg as well. Spain is the only one that bringing something towards the table. And those are the countries, and those are essentially the pillars of the European market space. And they're all crippling. So what is the European currency essentially bringing towards the table? France is so broke that they're thinking about going to war to Russia just to make an excuse why their country has no money. During his remarks, he essentially brought up the idea of creating a safe investment product denominated essentially in euros, saying the creation of a euro-denominated safe asset metric essentially of renowned attention. He mentioned possibilities like converting some national government debt into European-level debt and combining essentially existing multinational borrowing programs. He also his criticism essentially comes at a time when economic conditions in France support his arguments for some odd reason. Fresh data essentially shows France's yearly inflation rate dropped to 0.8% in December 2025, marking its lowest point in 7 months. As you can tell, France is not doing too well. This figure essentially came below the 0.9% recorded in both October and November, and under essentially what analysts have predicted. The decline essentially happened mainly because of energy costs fell more sharply, dropping 6.8% compared to 4.6% decrease previously, with fuel prices leading the way down, which had some play into it, but also another bigger play was essentially the leader of France mismanaged the funds. This puts essentially Valerie in a strong position to make his case. While the American government is pushing the Fed to lower interest rates to help a struggling economy, Valerie essentially can point out that the European Central Bank's independent, complete BS. Numbers-based strategy has already brought inflation well essentially under the 2% goal without essentially any political essentially meddling. BS. The European Central Bank's independency, when essentially Bulgaria, for example, decided to, create a crypto reserve, create a Bitcoin reserve or crypto reserve, the European Central Bank said no. And they're not politically motivated, essentially, apparently, according to the French European Central Bank member. The European Central Bank moves essentially non-political in any sort of a way. But when Bulgaria essentially decided to create a crypto reserve, the European Central Bank said no. They said you have to follow essentially the MICA regulations. They said you have to follow essentially other nations. How's that independent? Because that to me looks like politically essentially motivated to tell Bulgaria you can't create it. But on paper, they're independent. Meanwhile, the debate over essentially Fed independence is moving from theory to practice as Trump's search essentially for power or essential replacement heats up. Fed Governor essentially Stephen Mirin told Fox Business essentially today morning that it hasn't discussed becoming the next Fed chair with Trump and isn't pursuing the position. He said it's not on the shortlist, calling the actual essential candidates extremely credible. Trump is now looking at the final group that essentially includes Kevin Walsh, who previously served on the Fed's board, and Kevin Hassett, who essentially advises the White House on economic matters. Powell's essentially term running the Fed ends in May. Right now, betting markets show essentially Hassett as the frontrunner, giving his close ties to Trump. So, the European Central Bank is trying to take advantage on the fact that Jerome Powell is out of the door and Trump is going to be choosing somebody that he believes is the best person to run it. Therefore, the European essentially banker coming out saying that Trump is going to be manipulated in the market space. The Fed was already manipulated in the market space before Trump ever set foot into politics, to be fairly honest. And the European Central Bank isn't independent. On paper, sure as hell it is. On paper, the European Central Bank is extremely independent. In reality, not so much. Same goes for the Fed. On paper, independent. Reality, not so much. Now, moving on from the European Central Bank's perspective on the crypto market, on the market space in general, and essentially trying to go against the US dollars. And by the way, regarding Trump trying to damage the US dollars, Trump was the man that passed the Genius Act, which strengthens the US dollars. Because RRUSD, USDC, USDT, and so many other essentially stablecoins, US dollar stablecoins, are actually backed by fiat US dollars. Hence why they passed the Genius Act before passing any other crypto regulations to strengthen the US dollars. If you go and see what backs USDT, what backs RRUSD, what backs USDC, what backs PYUSD, and the list goes on, the US dollars does. And bonds and some other things. But so does the US dollars. Fiat. Now, but bankers love to lie and manipulate what they say. Managing $7 trillion, Charles Schwab's, is what we're going to talk about next on tonight's live. As Bitcoin essentially enters 2026, it is both supported by global liquidity and faces concerns from investors following the halving cycle theory. I talked about the halving cycle essentially last year. And I said, the halving cycle doesn't matter at all anymore. And I was backed on that, essentially what Grayscale came out and said next, which the halving cycle doesn't matter. Cathie Woods came out at the end of the year, 2025, and said the halving cycle doesn't matter anymore due to the amount of ETFs, due to the amount of regulations, and due to, most importantly, going towards utility. Bitcoin's halving cycle doesn't matter anymore, doesn't play much of a factor as it used to in the past, because we're moving away from retail to institutional. So, Charles Schwab's coming out essentially giving their perspectives and trying to tell people one final time that the halving cycle doesn't matter anymore and people should stop using it as a factor in play. According to essentially Jim, the director of crypto research and strategies at Charles Schwab's essentially Center for Financial Research, the Bitcoin price continues to reflect a complex combination of a long-term macro trends and market-specific developments. He also stated essentially that there are 3 fundamental long-term essential focuses and 7 short-term factors shaping Bitcoin. Long-term factors include changes in the global M2 money supply, Bitcoin's resilience to inflation progressively essentially slowing supply, growth, and its overall adoption rate. Short-term factors essentially include market risk appetite, interest rates, and the strength of the US dollar, essentially, and excess liquidity provided by central banks, the supply of large Bitcoin wallets, and financial essentially contingency. Now, some of these short-term indicators are aligned in favor of Bitcoin in early 2026. He noted essentially that speculative derivative positions that triggered the sharp essentially sell-offs in late 2025 have largely essentially cleared, while credit essentially spreads remain tight. This essentially the risk 11 environment and equity supports crypto, the ultimate risk essentially asset. The analyst said, arguing that the renowned expansion of global liquidity is also providing an additional impetus Central bank essentially policies could also provide a potential boost. He noted that the quantum of essentially tightening has ended and balance sheets are beginning to grow once again, stating, "We expect interest rates and the dollar to continue falling this year. Liquidity conditions support essentially Bitcoin or the crypto market sector in general. However, some obstacles essentially remain." Says essentially, he also goes on to say, adoption may slow in the first half of the year, especially following the volatility of the end of 2025. But he believes that this trend could reserve essentially if essentially regulatory clarity increases. In other words, regulations is what we need inside the crypto sector to build essentially a strong foundation to be able to move forward. News can only move the crypto market space up to a certain extent and show price action. But if you care about the crypto market space, if you care about reaching some sort of generational wealth, and you care about a strong foundation, it's regulations. It's the only thing that's going to save us inside the crypto market space, not essentially price action based on essentially speculative news or any sort of news announcements. It has a positive play, but it doesn't have long-term play. But regulations do. Essentially, is what Charles Schwab is trying to say from the head of research. And he also goes on to say that the halving cycle theory also plays a significant role in investor psychology. In other words, some investors are still thinking that the halving cycle of Bitcoin is going to have some sort of play. And as long as people are still thinking like that, it's going to essentially make them do the exact same movements as the past, which means essentially they're going to be investing as they would in the past, not investing as how they should be, because that doesn't matter anymore. Furthermore, Bitcoin's relationship essentially with traditional assets is also showing signs of shift. He stated that essentially that he expects the cryptocurrency to move less dependently on broader macroeconomic factors and other asset classes, noting that while correlation with large AI stocks remains high, the link essentially with general stock markets indices is gradually weakening. In other words, crypto following the stock market is going to be separating as we go along. The halving cycle doesn't matter anymore essentially going forward either, and people should stop thinking that it does, because if they do think that a halving cycle matters, they'll be investing in that essentially sense, which is wrong. In other words, it's not going to be playing out the way it should be if people still have that same old mentality. The mentality that people should be having now is regulations, institutions, ETFs, real world assets, utility. No longer halving cycle. Now, moving on essentially from the banker's essentially perspective, Charles Schwab's perspective, to Ripple. And again, it's not just Charles Schwab that said this. Grayscale has said this. Kathy Woods has said this essentially from 21 Shares, and Ark Invest essentially has said this as well. And Galaxy Digital essentially CEO has said this as well, Novel Scott. And also essentially, I have said this. Before all of them. Not saying it to be cocky, just trying to say it. Now, what we're going to talk about next on tonight's live is moving away from that and to Ripple. So, news came out today that Ripple's CEO, Brad Garlinghouse, joins Evernorth as a strategic advisor after their $1 billion launch. Ripple CEO Brad Garlinghouse has joined Evernorth as a strategic advisor following the firm's $1 billion launch in October. Ripple executives David Schwartz and Stewart essentially are also listed as advisors, while Evernorth confirms XRP purchases and SBI's $200 million contribution. Meanwhile, Ripple X has also issued an upgrade for alert for XRP Ledger Vision 3.0, which has some relevance to lending out XRP. Evernorth confirmed essentially the appointees essentially of Ripple CEO Brad Garlinghouse as a strategic advisor on his latest leadership announcement on X. The leadership essentially team includes Ripple's Chief Legal Officer Stewart and Chief Technology Officer David Schwartz and Brad. This move aligns Evernorth with Ripple's broader ecosystem while preserving its operational independence, according to the firm's official essentially release. Garlinghouse essentially involvement supports ongoing coordination between Ripple and Evernorth, which manages XRP-related initiatives and treasury functions. Evernorth launched essentially in October through a $1 billion essentially transaction, with SBI Holdings contributing $200 essentially million in capital. Ripple also joined the funding round essentially along with Ripple Works, Pantera Capital, Kraken, GSR, and Ripple co-founder Chris Lawson. The firm essentially stated that we essentially structured our governance to ensure ecosystem alignments while maintaining strict operational independence. A portion of the funds was allocated to XRP, open market purchases, while the rest essentially were covering working capital and transaction essentially costs. Evernote emphasized that the independence of this treasury operations from Ripple's direct control, despite shared investment ties. So, Brad, David Schwartz, essentially, and Chris Lawson, essentially, David Schwartz, Brad, and essentially Stewart are going to be a part of Evernote. Essentially, it was announced today, which means we should be expecting maybe more investments coming out of Evernote in terms of purchasing out essentially XRP. Now, keeping on essentially Ripple and XRP news, G Treasury, the company that essentially Ripple purchased and essentially made the acquisition for a while ago, essentially in 2025, has now just acquired a new company. G Treasury essentially acquires Solvixa essentially to revolutionize and reconcile essentially in terms of regulatory reporting. G Treasury, a Ripple solution, today announced the acquisition of Solvixia, essentially a leading provider of no-code financial automation, data management, and analytics solutions. The acquisition essentially expands G Treasury's platform to automate essentially and regulatory essentially reporting across treasury, finance, and compliance operations, addressing one of the most persistent challenges facing essentially finance teams: manual spreadsheet-driven processes that increases operational risk and audit exposure. By combining G Treasury's proven treasury management and digital asset infrastructure with Solvixia essentially and regulatory reporting automation, the platform delivers a unified approach to treasury, finance, and compliance operations, helping organizations reduce risk, improve accuracy, and meet growing regulatory demands. What I'm seeing essentially in play is that Ripple is trying to cover all angles when it comes to the financial sector. When it comes to financial sector, in terms of payments, in terms of speed, in terms of cost, in terms of essentially custody, in terms of loans, and essentially also in terms of the paperwork that is now being automated. Today's acquisition of Solvixia essentially removes the boundaries between treasury management and compliance reporting. Essentially said Ver, the CEO of G Treasury, organizations shouldn't rely on manual processes that introduce fraud risk, disclosure weaknesses, and audit exposures, when automation can deliver near-perfect accuracy and complete transparency. The integration of G Treasury's capabilities with Solvixia's automation platform delivers unprecedented visibility and control across the entire finance essentially function, protecting CFO reputation while ensuring governance and regulatory compliance. Organizations essentially are simultaneously managing traditional banking relationships and exploring digital assets, all while facing increasing regulatory scrutiny across multiple jurisdictions, said essentially Idim, the CEO of Solvixia. The combination of Solvixia and automation capabilities with G Treasury's infrastructure extends the platform to ensure it's not just ready for today's challenges, it's built for the future of finance with the governance and audit controls required to protect organizations from regulatory liabilities. Ripple is genuinely building a foundation that's never been seen inside the financial sector to date. So Vixia essentially helps finance teams reduce the time and efforts needed to combine and reconcile, map essentially, and analyze data by automating finance, tax, and compliance processes. The platform enables organizations to combine, transform, and analyze all data to produce insights and analytics in minutes instead of days, reduce human error by up to 98%, and embed enterprise-class governance and audit capabilities across critical financial, essentially, processes. Honestly, Ripple, in my opinion, based on what's always been happening in terms of the announcements we get from Ripple, the foundation is trying to build, it's building a foundation inside the financial sector that essentially covers everything. It goes from essentially, as I said, payments to essentially custody to essentially lending, borrowing, yield, staking. The list goes on now to also essentially be covering the side of there was possible human error in and no more because of the automation and bringing towards the table. I mean, it's just on a whole nother level. It's not coming, as I said a long time ago, to play nice with the financial sector. It's coming in for a takeover. Hence why it was pushed out by the SEC and why the SEC was weaponized by the banking sector to not let it essentially climb the ladder that fast, to let the banks catch up. which really didn't work out too well because Ripple decided to go essentially worldwide and then come back to the US and dominate in that sector too. On that note, that Ripple is building a enormous foundation from end to end to cover pretty much anything that's needed inside the financial sector, we have come to the endings of tonight's live. That's a very big play that Ripple has done, a play that no other essentially sector has done so far. We have come to the endings of tonight's live. This was episode essentially 426 of the CMF live show. On tonight's episode, essentially we talked about Ripple, G Treasury company acquiring another company to pretty much remove human error up to 98%. We talked about Ripple's CEO Brad and a few of the members of Ripple joining Evernorth on their announcements today. We talked about Charles Schwab essentially giving their perspectives on the crypto market space. We also talked about tonight's live regarding the European Central Bank's perspective on the US dollars and trying to push their own currency ahead. We talked about Florida proposing essentially a crypto reserve. We also went through news on tonight's live regarding Tecurium, who's also has ties to Ripple and is going to be the first company to have a Venezuelan ETF, and this company has ties of Ripple. We also essentially talked about on tonight's live regarding Morgan Stanley filing a Bitcoin and Solana ETF, and we went through news regarding Bernstein's perspectives. And we also went through news on tonight's live regarding Bank of America and S&P 500. We also went through news regarding CPI data that's going to be released on January 13th, which everybody should keep in their calendars. And we went through news regarding Senator Cynthia Lumines' perspective as well. Now, that was the endings of tonight's live show. This was episode 426 of the CMF Live. We have come to the endings of tonight's live. I had to put my cross essentially under because it kept on touching the mic, which made that weird buzzing sound yesterday's live essentially. We have come to the endings of tonight's live. This was essentially CMF Live Show, episode 426, stands for CMF, stands for Crypto Mouse Family. My name is Miles. You tune to this live Monday, Friday, 10 p.m. London time onwards. For the next episode of CMF Live tomorrow, 10 p.m. The disclaimer of this live show, as always, is not financial advice, not political advice, and whatever I say is only for entertainment purposes. Before we do go, let's get started the comment section first, then we will call it a night. Also, if you haven't CMF members, like, retweet, comment, follow, subscribe if you already haven't. If you have, thank you so much to every single one of you. Ripple has set the foundation. It definitely has. Scott, let's go. Is Trump going to use Bitcoin to wipe out the debt? I'm doubtful if it is going to be. Miles, how is ADA suitable amount to hold? What is a suitable amount for ADA to be holding? Anything you can. It's not the biggest play, I wouldn't say. Miles, have you heard that Trust Wallet has been hacked? What do you think about this kind of attack? As I said previously in the past, the more we go towards a digital world, expect, essentially hacking and scamming to get a lot more better in terms of hackers and scammers getting a lot more essentially intelligent in that sector, which is why you should always safeguard your assets. Never connect your wallets to DeFi spaces. If you want to connect a wallet to a DeFi space, make sure it's not your main wallet. None of this is financial advice at all. Miles and CMF, Happy New Year. David, good to see you. How you doing? Happy New Year. Is Trump going to use the Bitcoin? We don't know. Ripple has set the foundation. Definitely has. Scott, let's go. Hi, Miles. CryptoQs. Good to see how you're doing. Good night, Miles. Bless you. Let's go. Cali. See you tomorrow, same time as usual. Once again, thank you, Miles. Much appreciated. Have a great night. Let's go, Mike. See you tomorrow, same time as usual, brother. Miles, Miles, just think people are thinking Ripple and XRP is going nowhere, and in front of them, Ripple is moving forward in a strong manner. Facts. Let's go, Scott. Thank you for your time, and have a good night, Miles. Let's go, Scott. Miles, thank you so much for an absolutely fantastic evening. I don't know how you do it. Let's go, Addict. See you tomorrow, same time as usual as well. Congratulations on episode 426. Thank you, Scott. See you tomorrow, but at the same time as usual. Great life, Miles. Happy 2026 to all. Have a lovely night, all. Let's go, Lena. See you tomorrow, same time as usual as well. Happy 2026 as well. I'm an OG. Let's go, Scott. I agree. Let's go, Scott. Thank you, Miles, and good night, all. Let's go, Stormy. See you tomorrow, same time as usual as well. Good night, Miles and CMF. Very good live. Thanks, Miles. See you tomorrow. Free forever. See you tomorrow, same time as usual. Stormy. See you tomorrow, same time as usual. Scott. See you tomorrow, same time as usual. Thanks, Miles, for the latest news. See you tomorrow, CMF. Let's go, Shelly. See you tomorrow, same time as usual as well. Good night, Miles, and thank you for another great live. Let's go, JP. See you tomorrow, brother. Same time as usual. Thanks, Miles, for coming to see you tomorrow. Same time as usual. Another great job tonight, Miles. Thank you. Let's go. How can I save myself from hacking cold storage wallets and don't connect to DeFi? Not financial advice at all. Share the live, everyone. Let's go, Scott. Let's go, Davey. Night. See you tomorrow. Same time as usual. Post a comment. Post the end of the show. Let's go. Night to Miles and CMF. Pablo, see you tomorrow. Sometimes you is Adam more important than Beam, and it will do bigger. I would say so, yes. Let's go family and promote our group. Let's go Scott. When can we see the bull run by Miles? I would say wait a little bit. Love and respect, Miles, my brother. Let's go Scott. See you tomorrow, sometimes usual, brother. Love you too, brother. Susie, let's go. See you tomorrow, sometimes usual. Miles, see you tomorrow night. Funky, see you tomorrow, sometimes usual as well. Scott, see you tomorrow, same time as usual. I will see everybody tomorrow, same time as usual. Everybody have a great day or a good night, depending on where you're around the world. See everybody tomorrow, same time as usual, for episode 427 of the CMF Live Show. Like, comment, follow, retweet, repost if you already haven't. If you have, thank you so much to every single one of you. See you tomorrow, same time as usual.